Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Ahmad Krisna Murthy. I'm from group 6. So group 6 will explain about the catenative construction and verbless clause. Okay, let's start with the catenative construction. Catenative construction. What is catenative construction? So catenative comes from Latin words means chain. So catenative construction is a construction that contain chains of verb where each verb except the last one has its own non-finite clause as the complement. Try to look at this example. She seems to want to stop trying to avoid meeting him. There are 6 verbs in this sentence, and each verb of it has a non-finite clause as the complement. I mean, each verb except the last one. So she seems is the head verb, and to want to stop trying to avoid meeting him is a non-finite clause as the complement of seems. And the chains continue until avoid. I mean, want is the head verb, and to stop trying to avoid meeting him is a non-finite clause as the complement of want, and the explanation is same. Stop is the head verb, trying to avoid meeting him is non-finite clause as the complement of stop, something like that. I'm sure that you understand. Okay, next, the simple and complex catenative construction. So there are 2 types of catenative construction. There's a simple catenative and a complex catenative. We can see the difference between simple catenative and complex catenative by seeing is there intervening noun phrase in the sentence. Well, if you look at this example, I will take the example number 3. Max regret locking the door. In this sentence, there are no intervening NP. Well, what is intervening NP? Okay, let's see this example. I remember Sue locking the door. Sue in here is the intervening NP, an NP that is interpreted semantically as the subject of the non-finite clause. Where is the non-finite clause? Non-finite clause is locking the door. So if in simple catenative construction the subject of locking the door is Max, in complex catenative construction, so take the position of I as the subject of locking the door. So the subject of locking the door is not I but Sue. So Sue in here is the intervening noun phrase. Note that there is never an intervening noun phrase in the simple catenative. If you see this example, me in here is not intervening NP because the subject of cheer them up is still Ed. Me is not take the position of Ed as the subject of the verb. And note that there is always an intervening NP in complex catenative. Okay, continue. Ordinary subject and raised subject. There are in catenative construction, there's a ordinary subject and raised subject. What is the difference between these 2 sentences? Okay, in ordinary subject, Sarah wanted to confess Ed, and in raised subject, Sarah seemed to confess Ed. In ordinary subject, the subject is connected directly with the verb. Like when you read this, you're sure that the one who confess or the one who do the verb is Sarah. But if you read this, Sarah seemed to confess Ed. The subject of this verb is not clear. Is it really Sarah who do that, or maybe somebody else? So from that you can see the difference, right? In ordinary subject, the subject is connected directly with the verb, but in raised subject, the subject is not connected directly with the verb. Okay, next, two ways of testing for ordinary or raised subject. So it's like a method to find out, or to find out whether is it ordinary or is it raised subject. So there are two methods. The first method is passive voice. Change the sentence into passive voice. And method number two is using dummy pronoun as subject, but I think I will explain this method, passive voice. Okay, using passive infinitive, you can read this, but I will make it simple. It simply means that you change the active voice into the passive voice, and you will know the difference between ordinary subject and raised subject. Okay, let's start with ordinary subject. Sarah wanted to confess Ed. This is the active voice. And Ed wanted to be confessed by Sarah. This is the passive voice. In the active voice, the main meaning of the sentence is Sarah is the one who do the verb to Ed. But in passive voice, the main meaning is changing. Sarah is not the one who do the verb anymore. You're not sure. In passive voice, you're not sure. Is it Sarah who confessed Ed? Because the sentence is Ed wanted to be confessed by Sarah. But it's that. Wait, sorry, cycle. Okay. In passive voice, the main meaning of the sentence is changing. Ed wanted to be confessed by Sarah, but we can see the possibility that maybe Sarah doesn't want to confess Ed. That's why the main meaning of the sentence is changing. But in raised subject, Sarah seemed to confess Ed. This is the active voice, and Ed seemed to be confessed by Sarah. This is the passive voice. The main meaning of these two sentences is same, or the main meaning where you change the active voice into passive voice, the main meaning isn't changed. The main meaning isn't changed, right? Sarah seemed to confess Ed. By reading this sentence, we know, or we assume, that Sarah is the one who confessed Ed. And when you read this sentence, the passive voice of this sentence, Ed seemed to be confessed by Sarah. The main meaning isn't changed. You still think that Sarah is the one who seemed to confess Ed. Okay, I hope that you understand. I will explain again. In ordinary subject, if you change the active voice into the passive voice, the main meaning of the sentence is changed, or between active voice and passive voice, the main meaning is different. But in raised if it's raised subject, when you change the active voice into passive voice, the main meaning of these two sentences is same, or we can say that the main meaning of the sentence isn't changed. Okay. Note, it's important not to be missed by the fact that the sentence with the passive infinitive might sound unnatural. Okay, if you look at this example, Max began to sweep the floor. This is the active voice, and the floor began to be swept by Max. This is the passive voice, but the passive voice in here is something that unnatural, or something that unnatural to say. It's like how to explain. It's a sentence that unnatural to say. Have you ever heard someone who said like this? Uh, yeah. So if you found something like this, you can't you can say that this is ordinary, or this is or this is ordinary, or this is waste subject, because the level of these two sentences is the same, or we can't say whether the sentence is ordinary or waste subject, because the passive voice of this sentence is unnatural to say. Okay, I think that's all from me, and my friend will continue the explanation. And I'm sorry if my explanation is confusing, or maybe there are some mistakes when I explain it. And thank you for your attention. That's all. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, here I'm going to talk about using dummy pronouns. A dummy element is one that has no independent meaning of its own but occurs in a certain construction simply to satisfy some syntactic requirement. There are two dummy elements belonging to the category of pronouns. First is dummy it. It's used to fill the vacated of subject position because it is extraposition clause. Extraposition clause is when a subordinate clause occurs as the subject or internal complement of a clause. It can be moved out of the clause and the pronoun it is left to stand its place. Like the example, it is likely that she will go is the extrapositional clause, and that she will go is likely is the canonical of the clause. It is likely is the subordinate clause of this canonical clause. So if we want change it into extraposition clause, we have to add dummy it to be the subject, or the complement of it is. And the second is dummy there is used to fill the vacancies of subject because it is existential clause. In this clause there is no canonical version. Existential clause are used to provide information about the location or existence of particular reference. Like the example, there is plenty of time. The existential clause. Plenty of time in this clause is the internal complement of the verb auxiliary is, and to fill the subject position, it fills with the dummy pronoun there. And for note, the dummy pronoun above cannot function as an ordinary subject to a catenative verb because an ordinary subject is semantically related to the catenative verb, and this is not possible with a meaningless dummy. But dummy pronoun can occur as an right subject. For the example, in ordinary subject, it wants to be likely that she will go. It's incorrect because wants is a catenative verb, and a catenative verb cannot meet the dummy pronouns. In the exemplary subject, it seems to be likely she will go. It's low. Because since is not the catenative verb. And the next is existential there. Also like the extrapositional it cannot meet the catenative verb. In ordinary subject, it's incorrect. There wants to be plenty of time. In right subject, it's low to fill the dummy pronoun. There seems to be plenty of time. Okay, for the next is gerund participle. The distinction between the two kinds of subject is also found in gerund participle. The word regret takes an ordinary subject, while keep takes an right subject. Let's take a look at the example. For the first is the example of ordinary subject. In ordinary subject, for the first and second example, has two different truth condition. For the first attribute, regret to add, and the second attribute is regret to me. And for the third example of the ordinary subject is incorrect because regret take an ordinary subject, and ordinary subject cannot fill with the dummy pronoun. That's why it's incorrect. And for the next example is in right subject. For the first and second example are equivalent. Both of them say that the situation of Ed interrupting me occurred repeatedly. And for the third example is correct because keep text and right subject. That's why it can fill the dummy pronoun there. The next is auxiliary verb. In general, auxiliary take right subject, but there is exceptional. It takes an ordinary subject. That's why in the third example of A is incorrect because there take an ordinary subject and there is dummy pronoun. Dummy pronoun cannot meet the ordinary subject. That's why the cause in the example of the third A is incorrect. And the next material is complex catenative construction. It's the construction that contains an intervening noun phrase and noun phrase located between the two verbs and interpreted as the subject of the dependent clause. There are four subtypes of this construction. The first is as the subject of the embedded clause, the second as the subject of the gerund participle, the third is as the subject of letter, and the fourth is as the subject of matrix clause. There are three ways to constructing the belief construction with the arranged construction containing the subordinate for. The first with passive, the second with insertion of adjunct, and the third with pseudo-clef construction. In the passive, the distinction between the belief and arranged with for is located in the intervening noun phrase. If we use belief to make a passive voice, the intervening noun phrase can be the subject of the clause, but if we use arrange with verb, the intervening noun phrase cannot be the subject of the clause. That's why we need the dummy pronoun it to fill the subject position. And second is insertion of adjunct. With belief, the intervening noun phrase also behave like an object of the matrix clause. That's why it cannot be separated from the verb by an adjunct, such as letter. But in arrange with for, it can be separated with adjunct such as letter.
Now, I will continue to explain this material, and I will explain about the pseudo-clef and verbless clause. Pseudo-clef is a kind of clef sentence in which the subordinate clause is a relative clause headed by interrogative form, and pseudo-clef also called W8 clef. And the function, of course, to clef sentence, but they are formed with the pronoun verb. And then pseudo-clef also another construction belonging to the information packaging domain. The emphasis in pseudo-clef sentence is on the phrase after the word clause plus be. And let's see the example. Number one is what we believe was them to be conspiring against us, and number two is what we arranged was for them to meet the manager. Okay, let's see example number two. What we arranged was for them to meet the manager. We know the example can be clef divided into two parts as a reflect in the clef component of the name. One part is for them to meet the manager is made complement of the verb be, and while the other we arrange is contained within the subject, which begins with the relative pronoun verb. And the example that operation of forming a pseudoclave can be performed on example number 2, but cannot on example number 1. The reason is, in example number 2, for them to meet the manager is a syntactic constituent, a clause. As such, it can be placed in the position of complement to the verb be. And then example number 1, we cannot divide into two parts because the sentence has no clef clearly, and the sentence is a unity. And then let's see the sentence. What we believe was them to be conspiring against us. Them to be conspiring against us is not syntactic constituent and hence cannot function as complement to be. And it is not a syntactic constituent because it is a sequence of two complement beliefs. Them is object, and to be conspiring against us is a non-finite clause functioning as catenative complement. The distinction between ordinary and raised object is, an ordinary object is semantically related to the metric verb, while a raised object is not. It is located semantically in the metric clause, but belongs semantically in the catenative complement. And metric clause is clause that contains subordinate clause, or we can say clause within which subordinate clause is embedded. And then the verb of the metric clause can be referred to as the metric verb. And let's see the example of ordinary and raised object. Ordinary object. We urge you especially to examine it. We urge you it to be examined by specialists. We urge you there to be an adult. We urge you it to be clear to it that he was on probation. And the raised object, we want a specialist to examine it. We want it to be examined by a specialist. We want there to be an adult present. We want it to be clear to it that he was on probation. Example in raised and ordinary object. In ordinary object, the object is specialist is semantically related to the verb argue, indicating the person we spoke or wrote to with the aim of getting them to examine it. In raised object, however, there is no such direct semantic relation between a specialist and want. What we want was not a specialist, but the examination of it by a specialist. And this difference between urge and want construction can be brought out by the passive infinitival and demi-pronouns that modify the distinguish between different kinds of object rather than different kinds of subject. And example number 2 in ordinary object is differ subtly in core meaning from number 1 because this time it is at not a specialist that we were trying to influence. But in example in race, number 2 has the same third condition as the number 1. Again, what we want was not at, but the examination of at by a specialist. So we can conclude that a raised object into the metric clause makes no semantic difference given that the metric verb is not transitive. But ordinary construction make a difference to the semantic. While in example number 3, raised objects are perfectly normal, but ordinary objects are inadmissible because the semantically empty there and it cannot enter into a semantic relation with argue. They cannot indicate who we try to influence. What is verbless clause? A clause which lacks a verb and often a subject also. They omit verb is typically a form of be and recoverable from the situational or linguistic context. Verbless clauses differ more radically in structure from canonical clauses than do non-finitive. They have a much restricted distribution than a non-finitive, being associated primarily with the adjunct function. And here they may function as complement to a preposition or else serve as adjunct directly. Verbless clause as complement to a preposition. There is no preposition that presents only a verbless clause as complement, but with and without except non-finity and verbless clause and few other such as although, if, on, and while, except three kinds of clause: finity, non-finity, and verbless. And the example: he had been on the beach without anyone noticing him. This is a non-finity because noticing is gerund and gerund is included in non-finity. And next, he had been on the beach without any sunscreen on. We know in this clause without any sunscreen there are no verb, so this is a verbless. And next, while I was working in Boston, I lived with my aunt. This is finity because I was working in Boston is a complex sentence. And next, and while working in Boston, I live with my aunt. We know that is non-finity because working is gerund or verb plus ing. And while in Boston, I live with my aunt. There is verb plus because there is no verb, but this sentence can be expanded. The adjunct can be expanded to while I was in Boston. In any sunscreen is the subject and on the predicate consisting of the locative complement on. The relation like that expressed infinity clause by be. There wasn't any sunscreen on him, though it would not be possible to insert be in this example itself. And verbless clause functioning directly as adjunct. Verbless clause with a subject predicate structure can function as adjunct as illustrated in such example as this. The meeting finally over. They all adjourned to the local cafe. And next, the passenger, many of them quite elderly, were forced to line up in the sun. The predicational relationship is again like the one expressed in infinity clause by be. As in example, like the meeting was finally over or many of them were quite elderly, the adjunct in example number 1 has a temporal interpretation. It means when the meeting was finally over. And in the example number 2 is comparable to a supplementary relative clause in many of whom were quite elderly. Okay, thank you for your attention. If there are any question, you can post in a WhatsApp group. I'd like to apologize if my group made a mistake. Thank you and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.